And for more on these historic elections, I'm joined by Policy Director at Just Foreign Policy, Robert Nyman. He's in New York City for us. Good to see you, Robert. So who is battling who here? I mean, in the United States, we have the Democrats versus the Republicans. What is the political environment like in Venezuela? Is it a class warfare?
Well, I think it is. I mean, obviously, there's more than one issue, but every election since 1998 has been largely a contest between the supporters of the Chavista movement, which, as your report just described, was elected in 1998 on a platform of using the country's oil wealth for the benefit of the majority, and the opposition to President Chavez and his movement, which wants to return to the political arrangements that existed before 1998.
Now, there's been quite a bit of debate over who may or may not be financing the opposition's campaign. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, we don't know what the U.S. government is doing because the U.S. government is not transparent. You can't, even as a United States citizen, you can't go to the U.S. government and say, hey, are you funding, who are you funding in Venezuela? What are you funding them to do? The U.S. government won't tell you. Some documents have come out under the Freedom of Information Act that tell us things that happened in the past. So, for example, we know that groups that were involved in the coup against the Chavez government were funded by the United States. That's been admitted. In the report we just saw, the National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, as well as U.S. Agency for International Development. These are all active in Venezuela, and they're all funding opposition groups. But we don't know all the details because the U.S. government won't release that information.
Now, Chavez has referred to the opponents as, quote, the Yankee Empire's candidates. For this party, is the United States to be blamed for everything?
Well, of course, the United States isn't to be blamed for everything. There are other issues involved in Venezuela besides where you stand on relations with the U.S. government. But I don't think there's any question that the U.S. Has played a role. After all, the U.S. played a role in the coup. The U.S. media plays a role in feeding opposition stories. So, for example, the Venezuelan opposition decided that one of the big issues they were going to push in the election was crime in Venezuela. Governments, violence in Venezuela, violent crime, it's the government's fault. Well, as soon as the Venezuelan opposition came out with this, of course, it's trumpeted in the Venezuelan media, private media that are linked to the opposition, and then it gets picked up by the internet uncritically by the international players. It's a huge story on the front page of the New York Times. So these links, is it the only cause? Of course, it's not the only cause. Is it a major U.S. involvement significant? Yes, it's significant. And the U.S. government is not transparent about what it's doing in Venezuela. And given what it's done in the past, like its involvement in the coup, of course, many people in Venezuela are going to draw the worst conclusion that's consistent with available evidence.
Well, speaking of transparency, here's what else I found pretty interesting about this whole thing. The election campaign ended last night, and 150 international observers arrived in Caracas to oversee the election process. Talk just a little bit more about that, during these elections you have all these international observers coming in to say whether or not it was fair. I mean, we don't really see that in that many countries across the world.
No, you don't, actually. For example, one country where you don't see that is the United States. You don't see observers coming from all over the world, despite the fact that we have real problems with our elections here, as the 2000 presidential election showed, 2004 in Ohio. But the U.S. doesn't generally welcome observers from outside. Observers have played a really helpful role in Venezuela in the past, especially, I would say, in the 2004 recall referendum. Much of the opposition tried to claim fraud after the election and tried to delegitimize the outcome of the election. And you still see this today in some press, people trying to say that there was substantial fraud in the 2004 recall. But they were substantially blocked from doing that. And the reason was that there were observers from the Organization of American States and from the Carter Center who observed the election and issued reports afterwards saying, we didn't see any significant fraud that would have changed the outcome. That shut down the opposition claims of fraud. So I'm actually delighted that there are international observers there, because I think that constrains the opposition just saying whatever they want afterwards, as some people probably will. You know, the government candidates are, the pro-government candidates are expected to win the election. There's some indication that some opposition people will claim fraud. How seriously that is taken in the international media will be shaped by what the international observers say. If international observers say, no, actually, we didn't see any fraud, then, you know, that possible claim by the opposition that there's fraud, that's not going to get, you know, much play.
Well, it certainly will be interesting to see what happens. Robert Nyman, Policy Director at Just Foreign Policy, we certainly appreciate your analysis today.